Hi, welcome back to the course, A Biblical Theology and Worldview of Why We Work. I'm new instructor Ryan Cheng. We're in chapter 4, Functions of Worldview. Repeating what was said earlier, worldview, consisting of deep-level images and assumptions, is tacit and it influences our behavior that are readily seen and shaped by belief, which we can readily describe. As such, a worldview has three main functions that work in tandem. First, it functions as a pre-filter to accept or reject things categorically. Second, it functions as a hierarchy to prioritize one thing over another. Third, it functions as cognitive bias to justify what has been accepted, rejected categorically, or prioritized. These functions are all an attempt to interpret and judge spiritual and material realities that occur daily in our lives, both private and public. Let's examine each function one by one carefully. Section A, first function, a filter to accept or reject things categorically. What does this all mean? One function of worldview is that of a pre-filter through which some things are kept while others are discarded and dismissed categorically. The first question to consider is whether there is a needful or pre-filter. King Solomon declared in Ecclesiastes 7:21, quote, "Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you." End of quote. Here, not paying attention to every word somewhat describes one important function of worldview. How so? In the course of daily life, if every incident, both private and public, is deemed equally important and weighty in need of further probing and analysis, life would be very burdensome. Furthermore, there are seemingly infinite number of events, for example, crime, war, natural disasters, etc., occurring in our world over which humans have no control, and as a result, they feel helpless and powerless. By the way, this probably wasn't an issue prior to the invention of telegraph in the mid-19th century when most news was local. Of course, not today. That being said, a worldview functioning as a pre-filter keeps us from paying attention to every reality surrounding us. That is necessary, but not always good. Why? It's because in today's world, where everyone has access to technology 1,000 times more powerful than a telegraph, we have allowed the media, both mainstream and social, to filter things for us. So, for instance, while we care a great deal about wars happening in Ukraine and Israel, ostensibly because the media constantly reports on them, hardly anyone cares about wars the media doesn't prioritize, such as the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. None of us heard about it, but it's a real war with real death and damages to properties. Obviously, this shows the potential power of the media to manipulate how we view reality. So then, how does a worldview function as a pre-filter? It does so through creating two larger categories, one to accept and the other to reject things categorically. On the one hand, certain things are categorically accepted because of their presumed correctness, utility, that is, essentiality, even ethical importance. On the other hand, certain things are categorically dismissed for being incorrect, useless, that is, unessential, or ethically unpleasant. Two things to remember are, one, what undergirds these categories is cognitive bias that provides its justification. More on that later. Two, as hinted earlier, categories are formed and hardened through socialization, beginning with what children learn by imitating their parents or other adult figures. So then, what does a categorical rejection or denial look like? After offering two examples, I will show how it relates to work. The Pharisees, the religious leaders during the time of Jesus who enjoyed many privileges, felt threatened by the popularity of Jesus among the people. In fact, it became very personal. For instance, they said to each other, this is John 11:47, quote, "What are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him." End of quote. No more following. One day, a man blind from birth, after having been healed by Jesus, defended the Lord when the Pharisees accused Jesus of being a sinner. John 9:24, saying, quote, "If this man, Jesus, were not from God, he could do nothing." End of quote. John 9:33. In response, the Pharisees rejected the claim made by the healed man by categorically rejecting him as a person unworthy to teach them anything, likely due to his low social class. Verse 34, quote, "They answered him, 'You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?' And they cast him out." End of quote. In other words, the blind man was canceled categorically. Didn't matter what he said. The Pharisees' penchant to categorically reject people was also extended to Christ. Returning to the story of Jesus healing a man born blind, he did so by way of making mud, obviously using his hand to do so, to put it on the blind man's eyes. Now, this healing took place on the Sabbath, the day of rest for the Jews, during which no work was to be done. So, the Pharisees, to discredit Jesus, made healing a prohibited activity on the Sabbath by categorizing it as work. All the more since Christ used his hand to make the mud to heal the man. They then categorically rejected Jesus, for some of the Pharisees said, quote, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." End of quote. John 9:16. This made sense to the Pharisees since they had made healing on the Sabbath a violation of God's law, and no one who breaks it could possibly be from God. This is an example of cognitive bias backing or justifying, in this case, a categorical rejection of Christ. Although this assumption was inaccurate, much like believing in a flat earth, it worked for the Pharisees, who later successfully convinced the people to ask Pilate to crucify Jesus. In light of that, let's consider the worldview of the Pharisees. The worldview of the Pharisees on the surface appeared very God-centered and otherworldly. But underneath the iceberg, it was materialistic and this worldly. What does this mean? The appeal to spiritual reality, otherworldly, was a decoy to direct attention away from the true state of heart. And it was Jesus who knew about this all alone. Luke notes that Jesus knew, quote, "The Pharisees love money," end of quote. Luke 16:14. This is to say, money and gold had more value to them, the Pharisees, than the temple itself. No wonder Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:16, quote, "Woe to the Pharisees, blind guys! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath." End of quote. Seen from a different angle, the Pharisees wanted all of their rewards for doing good here and now on earth. Recall that Jesus differentiated between rewards on earth and rewards in heaven, saying, quote, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. They, that is those who give to the needy to be honored by men, have received their rewards in full." End of quote. Matthew 6, verse 1 and 2. Meaning what? The Pharisees wanted their generosity to be rewarded on earth, being honored by man, which shows that they weren't that expectant of the world to come. the next age. Jesus became a problem for the Pharisees because he was getting in their way, since people preferred Jesus and his teaching over theirs. This is part of secularism, as in the only thing that matters is what happens in this world. More on this later in the course. Much in the same way, cross-capitalists operate their business with a materialistic and this worldly worldview. The main purpose for conducting business is to make money fast at all costs and to keep every penny to enjoy the good life here. The rich man featured in a parable in Luke 12 fits the bill. After an abundant harvest, he says to himself, quote, I have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Such materialist worldview is frowned by the scripture. One reason being that it can lead to losing what has been earned and accumulated. Proverbs 23 verse 4 and 5 states, quote, do not wear yourself out to get rich. Do not trust your own cleverness. Cast but a glance at riches and they are gone, for they will surely sprout wings and fly up to the sky like an eagle. End of quote. And in the case of the rich fool, the end of his time on earth came a lot sooner than he had hoped. And he, quote, took nothing with him when he died, end of quote, Psalm 49:17. And assumably, someone else would enjoy all that was left behind. Another example of a categorical rejection, this one very relevant to work ethic, is the categorical rejection of spiritual reality by naturalists. The aforementioned Western scientists, astronomer Sagan, biologist Dawkins, philosopher Dennett, are naturalists whose worldview negates the existence of any spiritual reality. To them, those who believe in the supernatural world are unintelligent and delusional. Dawkins, the God delusion, or have been duped by a religious spell of myth and fable. Dennett, breaking the spell. So when naturalists encounter people who are just as educated and credentialed as they are, but still believe in the supernatural, they are baffled. Once, atheist astronomer Sagan asked his believing colleague, another astronomer I believe, quote, why are you a believer being an intelligent person, end of quote. In response, the colleague said to him, quote, why don't you believe being an intelligent person, end of quote. Still, rarely do the naturalists change their worldview since they assume that it is backed by fact. What they won't admit is that declarations such as, quote, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be, end of quote, an eternal universe, is a statement of faith in much the same way the declaration God exists is. Hebrews 11:6. We admit it, but they won't. Perhaps historical materialism is in play here, since these scholars make a lucrative living based on the sale of their books and high lecture fees. The propagation of their naturalist idea is primarily an attempt to feed and shelter themselves rather well. Now, since to naturalists, the material world is all there is, they categorically reject the supernatural world of spirits and demons. Thus, when it comes to sickness, whether physical or mental, it must be diagnosed rationally and treated medically. Obviously, this conflicts with the Bible, since some sicknesses are described as having been caused by evil spirits. This is Mark 9:25-26. Quote, Jesus rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked and convulsed him violently and came out, end of quote. But the Bible also sees the cause of sickness as physical. Therefore, it prescribes a medicinal remedy. To Pastor Timothy, who had a chronic stomach problem, Paul wrote, quote, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses, end of quote. 1 Timothy 5:23. It was believed that wine, cleaner than water at that time, taken in small amount, had a medicinal purpose. Therefore, it is both and. As for the cause, it is both spiritual and physical. As for the remedy, it is both prayer and medicine. More to the point, the both and paradigm also operates in the sphere of work and profiting from our labor. So then, how does naturalism relate to work ethics and people's drive to succeed in the marketplace? Along with categorically rejecting supernaturalism, the adherents of naturalism also do not acknowledge the existence of divine principles and precepts, i.e., immaterial force that God has placed in the universe to guide people toward true success in business. Subsequently, naturalists, if they were to be consistent with their secular worldview, would have to opt for moral relativism. Once a professor at the business school of Brown University, a top-notch school, who was adhering to moral relativism, admitted before his students, quote, "I can no longer teach business ethics," end of quote. This would mean that those adhering to naturalism will not necessarily heed a key precept at the center of Christian work ethics. Proverbs 13:14, quote, "Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow," end of quote. Meaning what? Be honest in business and don't try to make a killing. A failure to heed this warning will bear consequences. So without any absolute moral standard to refrain human access, the most important goal in business becomes maximizing the profit margin by using whatever method. Perhaps nobody embodied the categorical rejection of God's absolute truth governing the sphere of business better than Jeff Skilling, who earned his MBA from a business school very similar to where the aforementioned professor taught, Harvard Business School. Skilling, former CEO of now defunct Enron Corporation that once was the fastest rising energy company in America, was convicted in 2006 of securities fraud, conspiracy, and making false statements, for which he was initially given a sentence of 24 years in prison. Ironically, Skilling confessed that his favorite book was Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and he drew inspiration of social Darwinist character from it, the one who will stop at nothing to catch his weaker prey and will be in no mood to share his loot with anyone. That's the character that he was inspired by that led to his awful business ethic that hurt a lot of people, and I will have more to say about him later in the course. Now, in order to tap into divine principles and precepts that govern the sphere of work, money, business, naturalism must be categorically rejected in favor of biblical theism. What would theism entail? First, one must acknowledge by faith the existence of a personal infinite God and his immutable laws governing the universe and people living in one of its planets. Second, therefore, one needs to establish a personal relationship with this God. How? Through believing that the atoning sacrifice of his son Jesus on the cross was sufficient to restore the broken relationship between God and men due to sin. And this is why I began the course by pointing out that the primary purpose of the Bible is spiritual redemption. Third, once individuals have been redeemed, they will need to discover divine precepts and principles that govern their sphere of work, business, and money, and then apply them to their work life. And of course, they need to do so by the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, one precept governing the sphere of work is that there is no profit apart from hard work. Proverbs 14:23 states, quote, "All hard work brings a profit," end of quote. Paul states that, quote, "The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crop," end of quote. This is why I said earlier that the paradigm of both and operates in the sphere of work and making profits from it. That is to say, it takes both hard work and God's favor to attain prosperity. But does working hard always pay off? Does it guarantee success? The truth of the matter is that working hard has become a controversial idea in America because some have alleged that it borders on racism. What? How so? More on this later in the course. Okay, before we head to the next section, there are two questions for our discussion. One, reflecting on how you deal with your reality, interpersonal, business, do you tend to accept or deny something categorically? For instance, rejecting a proposal without even checking it out on account of the perceived character flaws of the proposer may be a type of categorical rejection. First, discuss or think about what that even means. And second, share an example from your life. The second question is, at work, how do you see your boss or employees or your coworkers? Do you assess their value to the company in character case by case or categorically? Again, get your notebook out and jot down your thought. So pause the video now. Okay, now we're in section B. We are now ready to talk about another function of worldview, a hierarchy to prioritize one thing over another. What does this mean? So another function of worldview is, according to Nash, to, quote, place or fit everything we believe and by which we interpret, end of quote. This includes our material and spiritual realities, which focus on the causal relationship of these two daily human events. This is akin to establishing a hierarchy of priorities of what to value rather than categorically accepting or rejecting whole phenomena. Once the priorities are set in order with proper justification, those deemed important enough to be placed on top will receive the most amount of care and investment, that is, our time, money, and effort. One area where a hierarchy is readily arranged in descending order is how the self sees others. This is to say, a worldview shapes how the self perceives others in terms of an in-group and out-group, or useful people and not so useful people. In other words, those whom we call we and those whom we call they. An assumption about the self that is highly prized in North American society is individualism that, according to Kearney, quote, see others as existing to be manipulated and exploited for personal gain. This is epitomized in the rugged individualism of the entrepreneur, end of quote. The rugged individualism perceives others in accordance with three basic categories: people as scenery, people as machinery, and people as persons, to use anthropologist Charles Kraft's framework. By scenery people refers to interesting looking people with whom we take pictures, like those we see while traveling overseas or in places like Disneyland, or could be homeless sleeping on the sidewalk that we walk daily. The machinery people allude to functionally useful people who are seen as an extension of machine that, for instance, dispense our cash. So a bank teller would be seen as an ATM machine. Put gas in our car, here a gas station attendant would be seen as an extension of gas pump, and give back our changes. So a cashier would be seen as a cash register. And seeing people as persons is extended to those who could add value to the self, whether it be social, economic, spiritual, physical, etc. These categories are then arranged in hierarchy of importance. Typically, the scenery people deemed as irrelevant are placed at the very bottom. The machinery people are in the middle, deemed as relevant due to their usefulness. The valuable people are placed on top, thus we treat them reverently. Now consider this question. In an environment in which functional people are seen as machine, how would they be treated if the machine breaks down? That is, people getting sick or better machine is available, that is more talented or skilled people are around. Demonstrating that perceiving others in this pragmatic manner is neither new in the 21st century nor a uniquely American phenomenon, a very telling narrative is found in 1 Samuel chapter 30, 11 through 18, that takes us back to 10th century BC Israel. The situation was that David and his 600 men were living in the territory of the Philistines to escape from King Saul, who was after David to kill him. When David and his men returned home to Ziklag from a business trip, usually raiding, but this time from a war, they found to their horror that their wives, children, and belongings were taken away by unknown marauders to an unknown place. After consulting the Lord and being assured that they would find them without being told where they were taken, David and his men left Ziklag on a rescue mission. So to which direction were they headed? Perhaps following the trail of debris or footprint, they hoped that they were headed to the right place. The following is what happened thereafter that led to finding the kidnapped families. This development vividly shows differences between two hierarchies with a contrasting priority. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 11, quote, "They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, 'Who do you belong to? Where do you come from?' He said, 'I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of Kerathite, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag.' David asked him, 'Can you lead me down to this raiding party?' He answered, 'Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them.' He let David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah." Verse 17, "David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode up on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken." End of quote. Now, let's first examine the hierarchy of the Amalekite boss. On top of the Amalekite hierarchy is a need to go from point A to point B as soon as possible. He was committed to efficiency and speediness. Therefore, he was not going to let anyone or anything stand in the way of achieving his objective, quickly returning home to celebrate and enjoy all the plunders. So, perceiving his servant as nothing more than a cog in the machine, he was dropped for dead as soon as his sickness made him no longer useful to his Amalekite boss. That is to say, the Egyptian servant was valuable to his boss as long as he served a function. No doubt his place was taken over by another cog, that is, another useful servant. In contrast, we see the hierarchy of a different boss in David. While David's need was more pressing and urgent than that of the Amalekite boss, that is, finding the kidnapped families in contrast to enjoying the plunders, David first addressed the physical needs of the sick servant, whereas his own Amalekite boss discarded him once he became non-functional, even though it was likely temporary, which made no difference to his Amalekite boss. David, seeing the abandoned servant as a person, perhaps remembering that he too was created in God's image, put this man's urgent need for food and water above his greater need to find the families, including his own. Ironically, the very servant left to die by his Amalekite boss, who did so in order to quickly achieve his objective, led to his eventual demise. The grateful Egyptian, after asking and then receiving immunity from David for his part in the Ziklag raid, provided the necessary information that was absolutely critical in rescuing the women and children. What would have happened if David had treated the Egyptian harshly? If David had threatened him from the outset, the nervous servant wouldn't have volunteered to offer what was self-incriminating information. But he offered the pivotal information in response to David's compassion and likely his own desire to take revenge on his master. Now, imagine an employer who says he believes in God and goes to church every Sunday. But if he treats his employees like the Amalekite boss, then that means God's truth has not yet transformed his worldview governing human relationship in general and employer-employee relationship in particular. The Apostle Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, quote, "Do nothing out of self-ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself," end of quote. In Colossians 4:1, the apostle says, quote, "Masters, treat your bondservant justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven," end of quote. The Amalekite master didn't consider his sick servant better than himself and certainly didn't treat him justly and fairly. Of course, this isn't to suggest that profiting shouldn't be a main goal of doing business. What this narrative suggests, however, is that there's a better way to achieve success. Meaning what? When we are committed to compassion, selflessness, and generosity toward our employees and clients, God himself will provide the means to successfully fulfill the task at hand, provided that we work diligently. Now, let's consider the example of prioritizing land. Unlike American pioneers, Native Americans' perception of land ownership is rental, not possessional. This reverential attitude apparently stems from viewing the land as sacred. If a person who sees land ownership as rental is engaged in the logging industry, how would that affect his business practice? More than likely, he would be dedicated to reforestation. God's word sees land ownership in a similar vein as Native Americans. Accordingly, it is God who owns the land, not us. Therefore, the harvested crops are primarily viewed as what the land itself, under God's control, produces to feed the people, not how hard people work to make it happen. For instance, Leviticus 25:19 says, quote, "The land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety," end of a quote. In the parable of the rich fool, the man gathers such an abundant harvest that he needs to build a bigger barn. Jesus, in telling this story, describes the success of this man as, quote, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest," end of quote. Luke 12:16. God, of course, commands hard work. As quoted earlier, the Apostle Paul declared, quote, "The hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crop," end of quote, 2 Timothy 2:6. However, we first need to recognize that God is the one who provides what we need through what his land produces. Again, Paul declares that it is, quote, "God who richly provides us with everything," end of quote, 1 Timothy 6:17. Psalm 65:9 adds, quote, "You, Lord, care for the land and water it. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain. For so you have ordained it," end of quote. So then, what is God's expectation of those who live off the land? It is to live and work under the constant recognition of this hierarchy. This is why God expected the Israelites not to worship the land, as some Native Americans and others still do, invoking Mother Earth, but be good stewards of it, which included resting the land every seventh year. Leviticus 25:3-4 says, quote, "For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crop. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. End of quote. The stewardship also includes being rich toward God, being generous towards Him with what the land has given instead of keeping it all to oneself. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:18, quote, command those who are rich to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. End of quote. But in the parable, the rich fool decided to hold all the gain for himself. Luke 12:17-20 state, quote, he thought to himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crop. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. End of quote. Obviously, this man placed his own effort, hard work, as the key factor behind the abundant harvest, since he is rewarding himself very handsomely. But he's forgetting that his effort, however diligent he may have been, ranks third beyond God and land respectively as the first and second factor that led to his success. Ironically, the ultimate outcome of the rich fool's sudden demise is a Sabbath rest for the land, or at least some rest, which is one key reason why God allowed the Babylonian captivity in the first place. Since the Israelites never rested the land even once, along with breaking other divine laws, God had them exiled in Babylonia for 70 years, which is the aggregate of the entire Sabbath rest that the land did not get during Israel's first 500 years of existence as a nation. 2 Chronicles 36:20-21, quote, God carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. End of quote. Of course, the parable of the rich fool is not about the land per se, but what the person who doesn't credit God for his success does with his gain. He becomes stingy with God. After having the man die suddenly without being able to enjoy the easy life he had envisioned for himself, Jesus concludes with this remark. Luke 12:21, quote, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. End of quote. Jesus isn't hinting that every person stingy toward God will die suddenly. Rather, his point is that attributing one's success at work or business first to our own effort would lead to a very unsatisfying and unfulfilling life. To that end, the prophet Haggai, while warning the Israelites for pursuing prosperity without any regard for advancing God's work, in this case, rebuilding the temple, vividly described what this unsatisfying and unfulfilling life looks like. In Haggai chapter 1, verse 69, God says, quote, you have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. End of quote. Accordingly, such a sad outcome, that is, working hard without being able to enjoy, expenditures rising to meet income, is what will happen to an individual worker, a businessman who ignores the divine precepts and principles governing the sphere of work, money, and business. Okay, before we cover the last section of this chapter, there are two questions for discussion. One, considering the hierarchy of values, what values are upheld as very important in making new friends, hiring new employees, or forming a business partnership. 2. So what do you do when a trusted worker isn't able to perform his task at the moment because of personal reason, like getting sick, and you really need that done? Share that. So pull out your notebook and jot down your thoughts. Pause the video and come back when you are finished. Section C, okay, we now covered the third function of a worldview, serving as cognitive bias to justify what has been accepted, rejected categorically, or prioritized in a hierarchy. Now recall that all three functions of worldview discussed here are attempts to interpret and judge material and spiritual realities that occur daily. What sets the third function apart from the other two, filtering to accept or reject and a hierarchy to prioritize, is its ability to create, instead of interpreting a reality, constructed on a real cognitive base which justifies or rationalizes a person's strategy to be happy and satisfied. In turn, it quickly morphs into cognitive bias that will lean to one side or another. By cognitive base, it means that the individual firmly believes that his beliefs, feelings, and decisions are based on accurate and sufficient knowledge of the situation, even if that isn't entirely true, but he thinks so. Now, the accuracy of a cognitive base is not necessary to create a reality that adequately performs the function of self-justification. Recall that the ancient world did not become chaotic on account of believing a geocentric world or flat earth. For a cognitive base to function properly for self-justification, individuals simply need to believe that what they know is true. But since an inaccurate cognitive base can have detrimental effects on the self as well as others in the society, for example, the superiority of the Aryan race hurt the Jews, unwashed hands do not transfer bacteria hurt the patients, working hard is a racial ideology and encourage some people not to work, a truth encounter is imperative to correct a flawed worldview. Let's consider the example of defining debt out of existence. In America, where qualifying for multiple credit cards is easy and convenient, accumulating considerable consumer debt in a short time span is even easier since the interest rate is astronomical, up to 20% or more per month. While acquiring the latest gadget and taking vacations are certainly fun, credit eventually dries up and the consumers are sacked with unmanageable debt. So what do some consumers do to avoid feeling like they have a serious debt problem? Of course, no one likes to go into debt, but there is a type of debt that people are more willing to take on without feeling bad about it. Premeditated debt as opposed to impulsive debt. Premeditated debt refers to any debt people take on after having deliberately thought about or planned for it. That would include mortgages, loans, home improvement, student loan, etc. In the business world, this is tantamount to capital investment with which computer systems are upgraded and new manufacturing plants are built for their future return. Impulsive debt, on the other hand, alludes to the purchasing of consumer goods such as clothes, gadgets, on credit because of low cash flow. Now, it is often the case that the consumers don't necessarily feel worried. They continue to feel happy as long as they take on premeditated debt. That's to say, the cognitive base that justifies his spending is biased toward debt. But debt is debt, and it must be paid off sooner or later. The more you owe now, regardless of the reason, the harder it is to pay all off later. Imagine once again, this time a consumer who says she believes in God and goes to church every Sunday. But she contributes very little to a church financially while using most of her cash and credit cards to purchase consumer goods that adorn her physical appearance, like clothes, jewelry, cosmetics, etc. But she may feel justified in doing so because she made herself believe that God is glorified through her physical beauty. I once saw a television news in which a stripper was interviewed because she claimed to undress before men to the glory of God. So some people think like this. That's a severe and deadly cognitive bias. In this case, it is likely that the value undergirding her self-image is other-directed, that is, being guided chiefly by external standards rather than being God-directed, based on God's unconditional love and acceptance. This suggests that God's word regarding what constitutes true beauty for women has not affected her worldview. Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, quote, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." End of quote. In the biblical worldview governing self-worth, the cultivation of inner beauty ranks above the enhancement of physical appearance. One example from the Bible creating a false cognitive base that justifies a categorical rejection involves a generous boss and his workers who felt grateful toward him at first. In this new cognitive base, the roles are reversed. The indebted workers become entitled and as a result are ungrateful and pushy, while the generous boss is categorically rejected as unfair. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Jesus tells a story of a landowner who hired men at different hours of the day, 6 a.m., 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., 5 p.m. to work in his vineyard. The first group of hired men who agreed to work for a denarius, a fair day's wage, ended up working for 12 hours. Upon noticing that the last group of hired men who worked for 1 hour only received the same wage, they expected to receive more. Matthew 20:10 says, quote, "Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius." End of quote. However, when the first group of hired men received the same amount, they accused the landowner of being unfair, saying, quote, "You have made them equal to us." End of quote. Matthew 20:12. This is where the correct cognitive base, that is, the landowner is fair and generous, gets distorted, which then produces bias against him. First, consider the correct cognitive base that generates a true reality in which the first hired man feel grateful to the landowner. Matthew 20, verse 1 and 2, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. First, they honored the agreement to work for 1 denarius, again, a fair daily wage. Second, they feel grateful toward the landowner for giving them work as part of a fair labor deal. Third, they operate on the assumption that the landowner has the right to do what he wants with his own money. Now, consider the incorrect cognitive base assumptions that inverts the correct reality so that the first hired man feel free to justify their sense of entitlement. Matthew 20, 11 and 12, quote, "And on receiving, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, 'These last work only 1 hour, but you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.'" First, they no longer feel compelled to honor the original contract. Second, they refuse to declare that they are equal to those who work less than them. In fact, they think they're better than the last hired man because they have worked longer and more. This new reality concocted by the first hired man reflects the work-based worldview of the ancient Jews who sought to earn right standing before God through good works. Romans 10, verse 3 through 5 said, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. This outlook then led them to look down on those who weren't as good because they didn't work as long or hard. Consider the Pharisees in the following parable told by Jesus. Luke 18, verse 10 through 12. Quote, two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. End of quote. How the first hired man sees himself in relation to the man hired last is no different than this Pharisee who feels superior to the tax collector on account of having performed good works. Third, they think they are being victimized by unfair labor practice since they are not adequately compensated for the amount of work they did. What's needed here is a truth encounter. In response, the indignant landowner corrects the worker's distorted cognitive base through a truth encounter. Truth encounter is objectively realizing and then personally admitting the incorrectness of what had been believed as truth. Matthew 20, verse 13 through 15, quote, I'm not unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? End of quote. The landowner's defense against their charge is very straightforward. He, in effect, tells them the following to neutralize their false cognitive base that was producing a serious bias. 1. I am not practicing unfair labor practice. 2. We agreed on a fair contract. 3. You have no right to tell me how to use my money. And 4. You are being envious instead of being grateful. And finally, I am being fair to you and generous to the last hired man. What Jesus has the landowner do here accentuates the importance of a truth encounter to correct inaccurate assumptions that produce an unhealthy worldview and a bias. That concludes chapter 4. There are 2 more questions for discussion, or if you're studying alone, to jot down the response in your notebook. 1. Some people try hard to earn God's acceptance, assuming that His love is based on our merit. False reality built on an inaccurate cognitive base. How would that person feel upon discovering that God's acceptance and love is unconditional? 2. Share a moment when you realize that you have been operating out of a reality built on a false cognitive base, chiefly at work, regarding certain coworkers or projects. Take your time, jot down your thoughts, and pray over it. Thank you. We'll see you in chapter 5.